My general stance on OnPush change detection is that you should use it everywhere for everything by default. If you want some justification on that stance and more info on OnPush change detection in general, I'll link to a previous video in the description. The TLDR is that I don't really care about the performance benefits of OnPush. I think it helps you architect your apps better. But there are some common scenarios with reactive forms in Angular where OnPush change detection can really bite you in the async validator. By the end of this video, you'll know how to avoid these common pitfalls, and I'll show you a trick for avoiding manual subscribes that you might not have heard of. So let's recap the scenarios that trigger change detection when using the OnPush strategy. These are when a component event handler is triggered, a click for example, when the async pipe is being used for a stream in the template and a new value emits on that stream, and when the input to the component changes. Specifically, the input reference needs to change, which means if we are using an object for an input and we just mutate that object, it won't trigger change detection. We would need to supply an entirely new object as the input. So the bad news for us is that there are situations with forms where we will want to render some change to the view, but it won't trigger any of these change detection scenarios. So let's take a look at a specific example that causes a problem. So I have this username control that uses an async validator. So this async validator uses an observable. We are returning this observable from the user service, check username available. And this is going to emit with true or false depending on whether that username is available or not. And to simulate a real server request, I'm delaying this emission by 1 second. But in this case, it's just a dummy test method, and we are just always going to return false. So we're always assuming that that username is not available, so the validator is always going to fail. Now, if I enter any value for the username and wait 1 second, we run into a problem. I've set this submit button to be disabled when the username control is in a pending state. So if the status is pending, that means our async validator hasn't finished running yet. So we don't know whether the form is going to be valid or not. But you will notice that even after waiting the 1 second for that async validator to complete, this button, the submit button, is still stuck in a disabled state. So this username control is not actually in a pending state now. But since change detection has not been triggered due to us using the OnPush strategy, the view is not being updated. Now I've set up this test change detection button here, and basically what this is just a button with a click binding on it, so that when we do click it, we're going to trigger change detection, and we can see what will happen when change detection is actually triggered like it's supposed to be. So if I do trigger change detection, we are going to see that that submit button becomes enabled again like it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be enabled after 1 second, but we're getting stuck waiting for change detection to be triggered some other way. So the good news is that this sort of resolves itself. The form as it is right now provides a pretty bad user experience. We don't actually know that some operation is happening in the background when we supply some username. So what we would most likely do in this situation is provide some kind of indicator based on the status. So what I can do here is I can subscribe to the status changes observable stream for the username control using the async pipe, and then I can just display that status. So now if I supply some username, we can see pending and then we see invalid. In a real situation, we would probably replace this invalid and pending state with something like a loading spinner. Now, this is something we would want to do anyway. We would want to display this status, but you might notice that our problem is actually solved now. This submit button becomes enabled again whenever the status stops being pending. So when our async validator emits, it's going to change the status of this control. And since we are subscribing to the status changes stream with the async pipe, when that emits, it's going to trigger change detection in our component. That was one of the 3 scenarios we mentioned earlier that will trigger change detection. So it seems like the day is saved and we can be friends with OnPush again. Only there are other problems that don't come with the convenience of fixing themselves. So let's say we are performing any kind of async operation, and as a result of that, we want to affect the status of the form in some way. So in this example that I've just added, I have some validator error messages that are only set to display after a control has been touched. So if I go up to the template here, we can see that I have this validator message here, this error message, and it's only going to be displayed if the control is both invalid and it has either been touched or the form has been submitted. So typically when we want to know if something has been touched, we want to know if the user has interacted with it. But there are situations where we might want to set that property dynamically. And to do that, we can use the mark as touched method. So this is what I'm simulating here. We pretend some kind of async operation is happening, and then we mark the age field as having been touched. So this happens on ng-on-init. So if I refresh this, I should be seeing that validator error message after 1 second after it has been marked as touched, because for it to be valid, the age has to be over 18. It's been touched, so it should display the validator message. But as we can clearly see, the validation error does not display after 1 second. It's only going to display when we force change detection by clicking this button. So we need change detection to be triggered, but this time there isn't any need for us to subscribe to something with the async pipe in the template. So one approach we can take is to manually trigger change detection with the ChangeDetectorRef. So if we inject ChangeDetectorRef, which we are doing in the constructor here already, we can call mark for check after we call mark as touched, and it is going to cause the change to be rendered to the view. So this is actually the same mechanism that the async pipe uses behind the scenes. So if I save this now, it's going to reload on the right here, and we can see that the validation message does indeed display as it's supposed to after that 1 second. But I really don't like having to manually deal with the ChangeDetectorRef like this. It's another dependency to inject, and I think it can lessen the benefits of OnPush if we begin to rely on manually triggering change detection instead of re-architecting our application. So I think in general, it's best to only use the ChangeDetectorRef as a last resort. So let's comment this out for now, and we're going to try a different approach instead. So now we are about to get to the trick, but there is some important context to provide here first. So I originally came up with the idea I'm about to show you in my Should We Really Never Subscribe video, although as I mentioned, I'm sure I wasn't actually the first person to ever think of this. The point is though that I don't like providing patterns I've just come up with myself as recommendations to you. So I can shoot myself in the foot with obscure patterns if I want, but I don't want to lead you or your team astray from established best practices. And there were indeed very credible people who did not like this pattern and said they wouldn't recommend it. But there have also been very credible people who I have seen recommend this pattern, so it isn't just all entirely my own crazy ideas. So this is basically a long-winded way for me to say I think the approach I'm about to show you is cool, but it is in no way some kind of established best practice. If anything, using the ChangeDetectorRef probably is closer to what would be the best practice. So the idea is that we can use the same concept that we used for the async validator. We can just subscribe to something in the template with the async pipe to trigger change detection. However, unlike this situation, we aren't intending to display the result of anything in the template. This doesn't stop us though. We can just add an ng container that subscribes to the status changes for the form generally, not just specifically for the username control. So you can see for this one, we're subscribing just for the username control. For this one, we're subscribing to my form generally. Now, since we are subscribing to that inside of an ng container, nothing will actually be rendered to the DOM, so we're not pointlessly adding stuff to our template, but this does allow the async pipe to trigger change detection for us whenever status changes emits. Now, if we save this, we'll see that this is not enough by itself. We still have nothing happening when we refresh the application. So the problem is that calling mark as touched is not going to emit a new value on the status changes stream. So it's not going to emit through our async pipe, and it's not going to trigger change detection. But what we can do is trigger the update value and validity method. So if we call this .myform.update value and validity, after we mark the control as touched, it is going to cause the status changes stream to emit with the latest status. And since we are subscribing to that status stream here with the async pipe, that means that this is going to emit, and since something is emitting from the async pipe, it's going to trigger change detection. And as we can see over on the right here, we now have our age validator message displaying after 1 second as it should. That means that change detection is being triggered successfully. So personally, I like the trick I just outlined, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, in this case specifically with forms, and also just as a general way to avoid manual subscribes in the class. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please feel free to like and subscribe before you go, and I hope to catch you again in the next video.